Every the 10th of November, before the sun rises, an old Marine walks into a quiet diner in Pennsylvania. He doesn't speak, doesn't order, just pulls out 7 chairs and begins setting the table: eggs, coffee, toast, and 6 black and white photos. To most people, he's just a lonely old man stuck in the past. But what they don't know is that he's the last surviving member of a unit that never came home from Desert Storm. And for 32 years, he's kept their memory alive, not with words, but with breakfast. Master Gunnery Sergeant Raymond Tucker wasn't the kind of man who talked much about himself. Born in 1950 in a small steel town outside Pittsburgh, he grew up understanding that work was sacred and promises were kept. When he turned 20, with Vietnam still raging, he walked into the Marine Corps recruiting station and signed his name without hesitation. Ray served his first tour as an infantryman in Vietnam, learning lessons that would stay with him for life about brotherhood, about loss, and about the weight of responsibility that comes with leading other men's sons into harm's way. He stayed in the Corps because it had become his family, rising through the ranks to become the kind of sergeant that young Marines both feared and revered. By 1990, when Desert Storm was brewing, Ray was a master gunnery sergeant with 20 years of service and a reputation for bringing his Marines home alive. He'd trained hundreds of young men, sent them off to various assignments around the world, and watched them grow into leaders themselves. When the call came for experienced teams to conduct reconnaissance missions in Kuwait, Ray volunteered without thinking twice. This was what he'd trained for his entire career. He handpicked 6 Marines for his team, men he'd worked with, trusted, and come to love like brothers. There was Staff Sergeant Lenny Marquez, his second in command, a smart kid from Texas who could read a map like poetry. Corporal Jose Gutierrez, the team's communications specialist, who never met a radio he couldn't fix. Lance Corporal Holloway, barely 21 but steady as granite under pressure. Sergeant Mike Sanderson, everyone called him Big Mike, who could carry twice his weight and still crack jokes. Corporal Wu, the team medic, who'd rather tend wounds than inflict them. And Private First Class Franklin, the youngest of them all, who reminded Ray of himself at that age, eager, brave, and completely unaware of his own mortality. They trained together for months. Becoming more than a unit, they became family. They knew each other's habits, fears, and dreams. Marquez wanted to be a teacher when he got out. Gutierrez planned to open an auto shop with his brother. Big Mike was saving money to buy his parents a house. Wu was going to medical school. Holloway wanted to be a cop like his father. Franklin just wanted to make it home to marry his high school sweetheart. Ray loved them all, and they trusted him with their lives. The 25th of February, 1991. The war was almost over. Everyone could feel it. The ground campaign had been swift and decisive, and word was already spreading that a ceasefire was coming within days. Ray's team had been assigned what should have been a routine reconnaissance mission, push 2 kilometers past the last cleared sector and identify a suspected Scud missile launch site near the Iraqi border. They'd done dozens of similar missions without incident. In and out before sunrise, gather intelligence, report back. But at 0330 hours, just as the team was preparing to move out, Ray got an unexpected recall to division headquarters. Intelligence had intercepted communications, suggesting possible chemical weapons at multiple sites, and they needed his experience to help interpret satellite imagery and plan countermeasures. Ray's instincts told him to postpone the mission, but the timeline was tight and the intelligence was needed immediately. He made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He handed command to Marquez and stayed behind for the briefing. "Don't take any unnecessary risks," he told his second in command. "If anything feels wrong, you pull back and wait for me." Marquez nodded. "We'll be back before breakfast, Gunny." Those were the last words they ever spoke to each other. At 0417 hours, the team's radio went silent. By 0600, Ray was demanding permission to lead a search and rescue operation, but a sudden sandstorm had grounded all aircraft and made ground movement nearly impossible. For 8 agonizing hours, he paced the command post, knowing his Marines were out there somewhere, possibly wounded, possibly waiting for help that couldn't reach them. When the weather finally cleared and the search team reached the coordinates, They found the truth that would reshape Ray's world forever. The team had unknowingly entered an unmarked minefield, old Soviet ordnance left over from the Iran-Iraq War. The explosion had been instantaneous. There were no survivors. Ray read the after-action report in a small tent, surrounded by the sounds of a war winding down and men preparing to go home. 6 names on a casualty list. 6 lives ended, while he sat in an air-conditioned briefing room looking at satellite photos. He folded the report carefully, walked outside, and threw up behind a supply truck. Then he sat in the sand and tried to figure out how he was going to live with what had happened. The flight back to the United States was the longest of Ray's life. Around him, Marines celebrated, planned homecomings, talked about what they'd do first when they got back to the world. Ray sat in silence, staring out the window, trying to imagine facing the families of his 6 Marines. He attended every funeral. He stood at attention while buglers played taps, while chaplains spoke about sacrifice and service, while mothers wept over flag-draped coffins. He handed folded flags to widows and parents and tried to find words that might somehow make sense of the senseless. At Marquez's funeral in San Antonio, Lenny's mother took Ray's hands in hers and said, "He wrote about you in his letters. He said you were the best sergeant in the Marine Corps, that he felt safe with you watching over him." The words were meant as comfort, but they cut deeper than any blade. Ray served 4 more years, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. He did his job professionally, trained new Marines, and followed orders, but the joy was gone. In 1995, at the age of 45, he retired and moved back to Pennsylvania, to a small apartment not far from where he'd grown up. He found work at a hardware store, helping contractors and homeowners fix problems and build things. It was honest work, and it kept his hands busy, but it didn't fill the hollow place inside him where his Marines used to be. For the first few years after his retirement, Ray tried to put the war behind him. He dated a little, made some friends, attended church occasionally. But every the 25th of February, the anniversary of their deaths, he found himself unable to get out of bed, paralyzed by guilt and grief. That's when he discovered Millie's Diner. Millie's Diner had been a fixture in the neighborhood since the 1970s, the kind of place where truckers stopped for coffee, where shift workers grabbed breakfast before heading to the steel mill, where everyone knew everyone and strangers were welcomed like family. Ray started going there because it reminded him of the places his team used to eat before missions: simple, honest food, served by people who understood that sometimes a man needed a quiet place to think. It was the 10th of November, 1995, the 220th birthday of the Marine Corps, when Ray first brought the photographs. He'd spent the morning at the local VA cemetery, standing at the graves of other veterans, thinking about his Marines buried in cemeteries across the country. He felt lost, disconnected from the celebrations happening at Marine bases around the world. He was no longer part of that brotherhood, but he wasn't quite a civilian either. That evening, he found himself at Millie's, with 6 photographs in his jacket, pocket pictures he'd carried since the war, but never knew what to do with. On impulse, he asked for a table big enough for 7 people. "Expecting company?" asked Millie herself, a tough woman in her 60s who'd been running the place since her husband died. "In a way," Ray answered. He set the photos around the table and ordered what each of his Marines used to eat: eggs over easy for Marquez, pancakes for Gutierrez, biscuits and gravy for Big Mike. It felt strange at first, almost foolish, but as he sat there eating in silence, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: peace. The other diners glanced over occasionally, but Millie's clientele were working people who understood that everyone had their own way of dealing with life's burdens. No one bothered him, no one asked questions. When he was finished eating, Ray left money for all 7 meals and walked home through the November cold, feeling lighter than he had in months. The next year, he did it again, and the year after that. By the 5th year, Millie had begun keeping the corner table reserved for him on the 10th of November without being asked. By the 10th year, Ray had refined the ritual: better photographs, laminated to protect them, each placed carefully beside the meal that Marine would have ordered. For nearly 3 decades, Ray kept this vigil alone. He aged quietly, his hair turning gray and then white, his hands becoming more weathered, but his commitment never wavered. Every the 10th of November, he put on his dress blue jacket, the same one he'd worn at retirement, carefully maintained and pressed, and walked to Millie's. The staff came to know him over the years. New waitresses would be gently instructed about the Marine's table and told to give him space and time. Regular customers learned to nod respectfully but not to intrude. Ray appreciated the quiet acceptance, the way the community allowed him his grief without making it into a spectacle. He never talked about what he was doing, never explained the photographs or the multiple meals. If anyone asked, and few did, he would simply say he was remembering old friends. Some years were harder than others. When Millie herself passed away in 2003, Ray worried that new owners might not understand, but Millie's daughter Susan took over and made sure the tradition continued. When his own health began to decline in his late 60s, Ray still made the journey, sometimes walking slowly with a cane but never missing a year. He kept up with what happened to his Marines' families through Christmas cards and occasional letters. Marquez's daughter graduated from college and became a teacher, just like her father had planned to be. Gutierrez's brother did open that auto shop and named it after Jose. Big Mike's parents were able to buy their house with the insurance money. Wu's younger brother became a doctor. Holloway's father served as police chief for another 20 years before retiring. Franklin's high school sweetheart never married. She kept his last letter in a frame on her mantle. Ray carried all these stories with him to Millie's every year, updating his fallen Marines on the lives that continued because of their sacrifice, on the families who never forgot them, on the children and grandchildren who carried their names. The 10th of November, 2023, started like all the others. Ray, now 73 and moving more slowly but still determined, put on his dress jacket and walked to Millie's in the pre-dawn darkness. The familiar weight of the photographs in his pocket, the anticipated smell of coffee and bacon, the quiet satisfaction of duty fulfilled, it was all exactly as it had been for 28 years. He was setting up the table, carefully placing each photograph beside its corresponding place setting, when he noticed the staff behaving differently. Susan kept glancing toward the door, and the morning cook had come out of the kitchen to peer through the window. Even the early customers seemed to be waiting for something. Ray finished his preparations and was about to sit down when the door chimed. He looked up to see 6 young men in Marine dress uniforms walking into the diner. They were clean-shaven, sharp-looking Marines in their 20s, and they moved with the confident bearing of active-duty personnel. What caught Ray's attention immediately was their unit patch 3rd Battalion, the 7th of Marines, his old unit. The Marines approached his table quietly, respectfully. The senior among them, a staff sergeant about the same age Marquez had been, stepped forward and spoke. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Tucker?" Ray nodded, suddenly feeling very old and very confused. "Sir, we've heard about what you do here every year, about how you honor the Marines from your team who didn't make it home." The staff sergeant reached into his jacket and pulled out 6 new photographs, cleaner, sharper prints of the same 6 faces Ray had been carrying for decades. "We thought these might be better copies, Gunny." Ray stared at the photographs, his vision blurring slightly. "How did you—" "Word gets around, sir. Marines talk to Marines. Your story is part of our unit history now. The Marines who never gave up their watch." Without waiting for permission, the 6 young Marines took seats around the table. They removed their covers, placed them carefully on their laps, and sat in respectful silence. Ray looked around the table at the faces of Marines who had never met his team, who had been children when his Marines died, but who understood something fundamental about duty and memory and brotherhood. The staff sergeant raised his coffee cup. To the 6 who didn't make it home, and to the Marine who made sure they were never forgotten. For the first time in 32 years, Ray was not alone at the table. Word of what happened that morning spread through the Marine Corps in the way that meaningful stories do, quietly, person to person, unit to unit. Not through official channels or press releases, but through the informal network of Marines who understood that some traditions are too important to let die. The next year, 12 Marines showed up at Millie's 20ation. The year after that, 20. Some were active duty, some were veterans, some were from 3/7 Marines, and some were from other units entirely. A few Navy corpsmen came, honoring the tradition of service alongside Marines. One year, a Gold Star mother came, wanting to sit with others who understood loss. Susan expanded the reservation to include the entire back section of the diner. The Marines always arrived quietly, always showed proper respect, and always paid for their own meals. No one asked for photographs or posted on social media. This wasn't about publicity, it was about honoring the dead and supporting the living. Ray still arrived first every year, still set the original 6 photographs on the table, still ordered the same meals his Marines would have wanted. But now, when he looked around the table, he saw something he'd never dared hope for: the continuation of a sacred trust. The young Marines would ask him questions about his team sometimes. What were they like? What did they care about? What would they think of the Marine Corps today? Ray found himself talking more than he had in years, sharing stories that had been locked inside him for decades. "Marquez would have loved meeting you guys," he told one group of young sergeants. He always said the Marines would get better with every generation, that each group of leaders would be smarter and stronger than the last. "Do you think we're living up to that, Gunny?" one of them asked. Ray looked around the table at their earnest faces, their obvious dedication, their willingness to honor Marines they'd never met simply because it was the right thing to do.